Okay, so we're going to
Okay.
talk a little bit today about this new paper, Propaganda, the Public Spheres, and the New Economic Conditions of the Digital Age, which is a paper we just published in Acta Academica. And one of the things that is really important for me about this work, because this paper comes from the background of your PhD research, several years of quite in-depth work, but really drawing out some key concepts there. And for me, this work is really relevant because I've seen in my own lifetime the transition from the kind of golden age of like internet is freedom, knowledge wants to be free, that like an original Silicon Valley when it was being run by kind of hippies and idealists and the venture capitalist vultures hadn't all come in, and there was this idea that the internet was going to be this beautiful new democratic way of communicating. Knowledge would just be available to everyone. Anyone could communicate with anyone else in the world. Communities could develop. And there was this really positive utopian view of the internet, which is gone. I mean, that view no longer exists. Australia has just banned social media for under 16s because they're so concerned about the incredibly toxic kind of psychological, developmental, cognitive effects. And there's a general sense that the internet has really become a kind of a place of hostility, antagonism, manipulation, like all kinds of adversarial and manipulative things are going on, and so that utopian dream of this extension of democracy over space through the digital domain, that that dream, I think, may have fully died now, but not entirely. And one of the things that I think is important in your work is that you are pushing back and saying, actually, we can still reach in that direction. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this idea of why this paper now? Why in 2025 are we talking about the internet bringing in this, what seems to be almost an old concept, propaganda? People don't use the word propaganda so much anymore. But also this technical concept from Frankfurt School of the public spheres. So let's start with why now?
I think that like these informational environments and landscapes have become so central to the way people operate and just function through their daily lives. And as that's happened, there's been this growing awareness of certain things, of content, of algorithms, of dopamine hits, of but people have started to develop this awareness that there's more to this, and that kind of that utopian thing that we were talking about, that's kind of been fading away as the kind of domination of these social networks have taken over. Um, and we see this in how people have become polarized online. And I think that now more than ever, following the emergence of these technologies and the ability to share all this information, we've kind of regressed. Instead of progressing towards a more enlightened state, we've seen communities, societies, the world fracture and splinter and become so divisively entrenched in these polarities that they've taken. And what's increasingly happening is the minute you decide to engage with a particular discourse online or with particular forms of content online, your algorithm then starts to bend around that. It starts to personalize more of that for you. And gradually, and sometimes not so gradually, you find yourself in a filter bubble. You find yourself in an echo chamber where you find yourself becoming more cut off from spaces that you were able to occupy and lines that you were able to communicate across. Now these things are not existing anymore. And as a person gets deeper into their filter bubble, those lines of communication get taken away from them, and they just get pushed into more hostile, more inflammatory informational environments. And
Yeah, and I think
we now
what's
see,
yeah, what's
uh,
so interesting there is the technologies of engagement that seem to do this, because what you're mapping there is this, what I was saying, this utopian dream of everyone talking to everyone about everything, but in fact what's happening is people are going down tunnels and they're getting polarized and radicalized. We're seeing these kind of emergence of white nationalist, neo-Nazi, extremist groups, some of them spilling over into like acts of mass violence even. We see like Trumpism, Brexit, these right-wing political movements. So we're seeing people getting made more extreme. You talk about the way that once you pay attention to something, you start being fed more of that and more extreme versions of that. So talk a bit about the economics of that. Like what is that for? That those kind of algorithmic tunnels.
so these metrics of engagement are the key revenue drivers for these networks. The more that they can engage you, the more ad exposure gets produced through that engagement, the more ad revenue gets turned over, and the greater amount of time you then spend on the platform. So this engagement becomes critical and crucial, and there's two things to generate and kind of leverage this engagement. The one is content, right? Content is what keeps you engaged. But the other thing is that the content needs to be of a particular type to hook you. And usually we find that it's content that is inflammatory, content that is enraging, content that or makes you feel fearful, makes you feel anxious. And from the work of Cambridge Analytica, going back almost a decade now, we were seeing how content was nuanced according to the kind of emotion that it evoked, and then how you had um, population clusters that were then analyzed for the kind of emotional vulnerabilities that they had, so that the correct kind of emotional messaging could be targeted at the most appropriate kind of emotional vulnerability. And usually that was to just get you to begin engaging. And the minute you begin engaging, these firms like Dow Pottinger, Cambridge Analytica, or whatever, um, they then get a bit more hands off because now the algorithm takes over. Because the algorithm is looking to personalize stuff for you. And usually, when you engage with something that's very general, something that's very generic, maybe it's a very big brand like Nike or Coca-Cola or something, it doesn't really tell us a lot about your personality and what that provides as far as personalization goes is rather minimal and low impact. However, if you engage with something that is considered fringe, it tells us a lot more about your personality, and it has a much more high impact effect on your algorithm and how this starts to personalize further content for you. And it can be quite surprising because you can engage with something, again, these examples like Coca-Cola and Nike, things which have millions of followers and millions of engagements, and then engage with something that is so fringe that it has very few followers and very few engagements, and yet you'd start to see your algorithm bend around that even
Yeah,
further.
yeah,
And so like I said, on the one hand, you need this kind of emotional vulnerability and these emotional hooks, but on the other hand, you need content. And we've now seen this over proliferation of content, which is now becoming even easier in the age of generative AI or with Facebook and then providing its own AI tools for creators. Um,
yeah.
yeah, and like going back, we really see this kind of pivot when we went from what was social networking to social media. Yeah, where It went from people having different profiles and different accounts so that they could communicate and relate with one another and share stuff to a place where people went to consume content.
Yeah.
These are two very different things.
So the
And
transition from social networking to social media. And one of the things behind what you're saying, which to me is really critically important, is part of the utopian moment of the internet, where it was like being generated by kind of, various programmer geeks in California, to today is the economic system. I mean that capitalism, let's just call the beast by its name, is that social media, all the mechanisms of the internet are now there to drive profits of highly centralized, extremely powerful corporations. So what is shaping what you are seeing is whether it has the potential to generate engagement, because engagement has the potential to generate profit. So that explicitly manipulative element, which is essential to why Zuckerberg is now one of the richest people in human history, I think is really critical there. But you also are explaining a bit about the specific mechanisms and why mainstream engagement doesn't change your algorithm, but fringe engagement does. If there's something that's unusual, that the algorithm will lock into that and say, okay, this has a higher significance than you drinking Coke. And so we're going to start feeding you more and more of that. And so there becomes this kind of escalating engagement. And it seems to me one of the things going on with this that I've certainly been really interested, especially since the epidemic, is the way in which it also draws some people into complete conspiracy systems, like radical conspiratorial systems, all kind of semi-conspiratorial systems, like, it's quite ordinary stuff like, immigrants are going to steal our jobs, or the woke mob are going to make your children transgender, or whatever it is. But these ideas that are both rage baiting and fear baiting, like the fear that something terrible is going to happen, so you have to react, or that you're just so pissed off by someone else being stupid on the internet that you have to engage. So deliberately being fed provocations of rage and fear seems to be the kind of the medicine of engagement.
mm.
So
And even like some forms of content that is not on the surface connected to a conspiracy that may drive violence. For instance, these things about, oh, did aliens build the pyramids, or are there megalodons still roaming the ocean? Um, these kind of things, we've been seeing them being able to spread along these platforms without really facing a lot of challenge because they're not overtly connected to violence. But what then happens is these still contribute to this kind of erosion of trust in mainstream critical institutions.
yeah,
And by you engaging with these forms of content, you are then likely going to get forms of content that are connected to violence and are connected to more radical things. Um, but I think also the more important thing to kind of emphasize there is that these things, even though they may seem harmless, is that they kind of solidify that idea that, oh, we are being lied to, and that if this can exist, then these other things can also exist. And if they're lying to me about this, then they can be lying to me about the vaccine, and they can be lying to me about so many other things.
yeah. And I think we
And
really
so,
see this with Trumpism. I mean, a large part of Trumpism is a loathing of experts, like a loathing of scientists and elites. And I mean, a lot of my work is critique of elites, but this is a different kind of critique of elites. Particularly like loss of faith in experts. Firstly, through the pandemic, loss of faith in medical experts, but then scientific experts, experts on climate change, experts on everything. So the faith in public institutions, the faith in the fact that government can actually exist to serve citizens rather than just to manipulate and exploit them in a cynical way. That seems to have really deteriorated in a way that it creates one of the fundamental problems that this paper is concerned with, which is democracy. Like that democracy is actually going through a phase of risk. So tell us more about like democracy being under threat.
Yeah, like aside from, we've created these entrenched polarities that are now pulling one another further and further apart. And then you create a situation where there can be absolutely no discourse between these two halves. And that having that kind of discourse is critical for the health of democracy. But now that everyone is gone from, I mean, what was supposed to be this democratic public sphere, um, but has now splintered into these echo chambers. And now it's gone beyond just that because now you have, um, Musk having X and Trump having Truth Social and um, the kind of political discourse is now not only being fragmented by the algorithm, but by the industries itself, as these industries start to pull away from one another or try to compete over one another. Um, and then, you create this environment where it becomes so easy for these bad actors to hijack political discourse, either by controlling the algorithm and leveraging the algorithm, or by astroturfing these spaces, like what happened with Bell Pottinger, what happened with Cambridge Analytica, or in more extreme cases like what happened in Myanmar, where the social network becomes used to um, facilitate everything from coups to genocides. And like in Myanmar, you had um, these accounts pretending to be people on both sides of the political spectrum and spreading misinformation to both sides to create this environment of uncertainty and anxiety and tension and terror and fear. Um, the same thing here here in South Africa with Bal Pottinger. Though it was not them themselves, but the Gupta bots and the Gupta bot army that conducted their astroturfing campaign. And we still see how the social networks remain culpable because that was 2016, and Twitter had committed to purging the accounts that were associated with the misinformation network. However, in the looting of 2021, four of those accounts still remained active. And that is very problematic. That is really terrifying. Um,
Yeah. Let's look
and
back to Cambridge Analytica, because for me this is a kind of turning point, certainly in my understanding of kind of disinformation and manipulation. Um, what's the Cambridge Analytica story for people who aren't in the know about it?
Cambridge Analytica a they were a product of this British electioneering firm called SCL, Strategic Communications Laboratory, but laboratories. But they set up Cambridge Analytica specifically for the US election, specifically for Donald Trump and Steve Bannon. What they did was they used a series of, so firstly, they got access to tons of Facebook data of users' profile data on Facebook. And um, this data set was, each time they spoke about it, the numbers kept varying. But it was a gigantic data set that gave them a lot of subjective information on, US voters. And they could then use that subjective information to nuance their messaging in order to target those emotional and informational vulnerabilities we were speaking about earlier.
Yeah.
And they could then use this to determine which way a person would move politically. And they actually began with these series of experiments to see how information that you engage with can actuate or direct your behavior. So online information directing offline real world behavior. But the idea was not to, oh, if you're voting Democrat to get you to vote Republican. The idea was, if you're voting Democrat, let's disillusion you to the point where you don't vote. And if you aren't voting, let's try to get you to vote Republican. So it wasn't just a case of, switching you from one side to the other.
Yeah.
It was a bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really helped to, um, kind of boost their campaign was the Gamergate movement,
Yeah.
was that they emerged, particularly to the mind of Steve Bannon, um, these, these communities of angry, isolated, largely white men online who felt that their political power had disappeared, who felt that the rising woke politics and the influence of feminism in pop culture was now eclipsing them, and they had no space left anymore. And their agency was being taken away, and their autonomy was being taken away, and their future was being taken away. And we saw them mobilize and weaponize these online spaces
Yeah.
to isolate and harass. But really, what this signaled was that there were hordes of angry, motivated, mainly men online, but whose values reflected conservative values, but who weren't really voting.
Yeah.
And what they saw was the
Let's just
ability
pause
to
there and reflect,
kind
because
of,
there's a lot of conceptual stuff that I want to flag the introduction of different concepts and different changes in thinking, and to contrast them maybe with the traditional idea of propaganda. I think is like a mid-20th century, the Nazis, the Soviet Union, Stalinism, where you have these massive centralized states. And one of the slogans of the time, I think it's from Stalin maybe, is one transmitter, 10,000 receivers. So this idea, like for the first time, people had radios in their home, they didn't yet have TV, but the centralized state could send out a message to tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of people. And that's that kind of brute propaganda, the state just telling you stuff, like you must do this, you must believe this. That's a completely redundant notion of propaganda compared to what we're talking about now. And the difference there, and this is why the Cambridge Analytica moment is so critical, is this idea that what Cambridge Analytica did is they pulled out data on people that people didn't realize. They thought they were just chatting to their friends and watching funny cat videos, but they were being surveilled. They were that everything they liked, everything they ignored, every emoji, every interaction with another person was being compiled into a comprehensive set of data, analyzing each individual's kind of psychological profile. And so we get this notion of psychographic targeting. And for me, this is the turning point in the history of manipulation, is the moment when social media becomes a medium for psychographic targeting, for working out the differences between individuals, not sending out a message to an entire population saying, well, this person who likes these 27 particular things will therefore be sensitive to this very specific micro-targeted political message, which you can then generate. And especially now with AI, you can generate highly specific, highly differentiated messages. And this is one of the things you can get at. You can get at gamers sitting at home feeling like that the world's abandoned them. You can get at people, boomers who feel like they're going to lose their job to migrants. You can get at people who feel like their religious faith is being undermined by the secularism. You can go after so many different, highly specific things that you've identified are qualities of individuals, and then target messages to them. Yeah. So talk to us about psychographic targeting as this epic change.
Yeah, psychographic micro-targeting was really this kind of revolution that changed, like how you explained, that changed how the dynamics of propaganda would work. So rather than developing a message and then communicating the message out, Now what you had was this rich subjective analysis of the population that occurred beforehand, and then finding a way to nuance your messaging within um, within those readings of the population. And this, um, it. Okay. Um, how do I put it? So they began using things like the Big Five personality model or the Ocean model, and then like Jordan Peterson's famous the Dark Triad set, to try and determine how these messages could work within these clusters. So based on whether you were a person of habit, whether you were prone to any kind of neuroticism, whether you were someone who was a loner, or whether you were someone who was more, one with the crowd, whether you were someone who was very open to new experiences, or whether you were someone who was very closed off to new experiences. All of these things were assessed about you and measured and weighed to the point where they were almost bragging that they had access to so many thousands of data points on each individual, from what vehicle you drove, to what color the vehicle was, to what year you bought it in, to like on very minute elements of your life. There were so many details being drawn from that
Yeah.
were
And
used
of
to
course,
measure against
increasingly, it's
you.
not just what you've engaged,
And
how you've engaged on
you then
social
end up with
media.
a very,
It's not just the data points of your social media engagement. They're pulling everything out, like everything you've used your bank account to pay for, all kinds of other records that they can access that are being sold, behavioral records of you and your life that are now being integrated into these social media data points increasingly, and through AI, the capacity to integrate and analyze those data points is just now gone through the roof.
yeah, that is really the one terrifying part, is that now the tools for them to just kind of generate the messaging is way more chilling and way more terrifying, especially because prior to this kind of AI technology existing, it's already proved so successful, this psychographic microtargeting. It's already proved so successful. So now that we have this kind of cutting edge thing that's only getting more richly developed, what it means for the future is very scary. Um, and the ways in which they were able to obtain this data itself was so casual. They had these quizzes like what Disney princess are you, or what Marvel superhero are you, and you would complete the quiz and then you share it to your friends. And but like that, they get access to your profile and your friend's profile. And so overnight, they were able to build this data set from just a handful of profiles into millions and millions and millions of profiles. Um, and then, yeah, then collating that information with your insurance histories, your medical histories, your purchase histories, it creates this very, very rich blueprint of who you are as an individual.
Yeah.
Um,
And the
and this
word you
is the thing,
use
a
is
lot of these.
scary. Like I think this is a very relevant word. The radical scariness of this. And so let's talk about what makes it scary, and the question that we kind of started about how is all of this a threat to democracy? Because democracy is kind of built on the idea that people can be well informed about their environment and can make rational decisions about that. They can understand what's going on and say, no, I want to be represented in this way on these issues. But two things are going on here. On the one hand, people's information is becoming radically manipulated. Like what information they have access to is being controlled in highly individualized and manipulated ways. But also their capacity to be rational, reflective agents in the kind of traditional way is being undermined because they're being hooked by emotional responses. That a lot of this, what's driving this, is calculating what will elicit an emotional response? What will make someone enraged, or what, or maybe even what will make someone spend a lot of money? But triggering emotion and behavioral response to those emotional triggers, plus manipulating people's understanding of the world. It seems that if those two things are being controlled, we can't talk about democracy anymore. And perhaps this is where your use of Habermas's notion of public sphere is really important. So let's just reflect on why is the notion of public sphere important, and what is the scary thing that we're worried about now?
Yeah. So Habermas, in the structural transformation of the public sphere, he not only gives us the concept of the public spheres as this kind of I idyllic democratic arena in which people can, voice their concerns and engage in discourse about things that are affecting their lives. And but he also outlined how, although that public sphere did exist, it had certain restraints. Certain people couldn't access it. It wasn't open to everyone. But then also as time went on and as commercial interests started to overtake the newspaper industry, what was then organic interest from the people versus what was strategic interest from these kind of commercial enterprises with the newspapers started to clash and compete, and eventually the kind of strategic rationality overtook um, the democratic public sphere. But with the arrival of the internet, you started to then see a lot of that talk emerge again. That, hey, we have public sphere, the one that is, a closer realization of what Habermas was initially talking about, because this one did not come with all of those restraints and all of those limitations and restrictions. This one presented itself as being more open, as being one that was a bit more truly democratic. Um, and so I think using Habermas is useful because, in his structural transformation, we see this rise and fall and disintegration of the public sphere. And this is very similar to what we've seen now. But the internet arrives, it gets championed as this democratic arena. Um, and then, again, we see these commercial interests overtake. So Google, for example, which, now is so central in how people use the internet. Back when Google was another search engine competing amongst, other search engines, they initially had this ethos of this ad-free ethos, and that kind of set them apart from your other search engines at the time. They were this free-to-use platform, and um, they rapidly became the very leading search engine. The big problem, though, was, particularly with their Silicon Valley investors, was that this model is not making any profit. And yeah, it's proving popular and proving successful, but if it keeps going on like this, they can't keep it up. And so um, they decide that, we need to make a change. And this is where surveillance capitalism was really born, where they found that, every time people are using the service, they're providing this excess data. Every time they make a spelling mistake or something like that, they are providing this excess data. This data is getting stored, and eventually it's just cast out as this redundant thing. They would refer to it with terms like waste data or data exhaust, implying data that was unusable, that was. But what they then realized was that within this data was a lot of subjective information about their users. And this subjective information could then be not only nuanced to improve the search results, but also to target ads more effectively. And when this change happened, not only did it lead to a dramatic spike in Google's profitability and resolve their kind of investor concerns, but it changed the way the internet worked.
Yeah.
Because now it sent a signal to every other internet, social media service or search engine provider that you guys are all sitting on these stores of waste data that could be really, really valuable if you start to build it into the service. And, or if you take it beyond that, and instead of just building into the service, you build a service around it.
Yeah.
And so you started seeing not only Facebook get on board with this, but Facebook say, okay, we are going from social network to social media. Because if we become a media provider, we can keep people engaged longer. We keep them engaged longer, we generate more of this excess data, which is the surplus data that drives this machinery.
So a fundamentally new
Going,
form of capitalism comes into existence at the moment. That's different from, like, Marx's view of capitalism. Oh, the workers produce, surplus value by creating something that's sold for profit. Here, the 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 information about the user is the location of value. That is the marketable commodity, and that is something that people have just been giving away. Been giving away by allowing themselves to be surveilled in every possible way, whether it's their online interactions, the location of their cell phone, their transactions on their bank cards, their fitness tracker. I mean, all of that are commercializable data sets, and not only in order to market commodities towards people, but in order for people who want to take social control, political control, to be able to exercise new forms of anti-democratic control that it's hard for us to even recognize. But one of the things we're talking about, the kind of organic interests, like the ordinary person is like, once their life, they want a good job and healthcare and to have a family, all those kinds of things, versus the strategic interests of the corporations. And it seems to me one of the historical moment we're living in is perhaps the moment of those two things getting blurred. That the psychographic micro-targeting, the personalization of people's information that is made available to them is and the specificity with which their emotional responses are being manipulated actually means that people start feeling the strategic interests as if they were organic interests. They actually start becoming
absolutely.
molded. This is almost like Foucault's idea of the panopticon, where the prisoner, instead of being locked in the dungeon where he can't get out, the prisoner is being seen by the guards and eventually starts behaving well because he knows the gods can reward or punish their behavior. So the person internalizes. They don't have to be chained and beaten anymore. They simply internalize what the authorities want because of they're being surveilled. And it seems Foucault's panopticon and social media are like absolutely the same thing, just in a more hellishly pervasive way that Foucault couldn't have imagined in the 1970s.
Mm. Absolutely. And the thing is, like, we talk about what Foucault could imagine in the 70s. Even us today, we can't even imagine the range of devices that each of us have that are surveilling us. Like, we think about the obvious ones. We think about our phones, we think about our laptops, we think about these, but there's so many other stuff that have these um, digitized elements in them that are constantly monitoring us from um, any smart devices in your home,
Yeah,
even to, I mean, if you look at the range of manufacturers that all decided to get into this Internet of Things space,
yeah,
you went from like vehicle manufacturers, which you can expect, to things that you would never expect, like Barbie dolls,
yeah,
that they would become tools of surveillance as
yeah,
well.
yeah. And your TV.
That is so uncomfortable because you're now deliberately a market for surveilling children,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, so
and,
we're tending towards a kind of infinity of surveillance, and one of the old problems with that is that you could have too much data that it couldn't be processed. But now with AI, that problem is no longer a real problem. That AI can just do the data processing on this epic scale that would be impossible before.
Yeah, it's really added to the kind of rate at which things about you can be learnt and then leveraged against you instantly.
Yeah.
Um, and
But
you know,
leveraged against you while being offered to you as a treat.
as if though it's your
Not
own
being
idea,
offered to you
as
as
if though,
the cop beating you over the head if you don't obey, being said, "Oh, why don't you do this? Look, you can now speak to your TV and tell it what to do. Isn't that awesome?" You know, and then but that means your TV is listening. That means your
exactly.
Alexa is listening to you. Um,
And
so
look, we have this um, attitude towards um, like, yeah, your TV is listening to you, but how many of us read our privacy policies, you know? How many of us, go to the third party section of the privacy policy to see not only what data is taken, but where that data ends up?
yeah,
And in most cases, you will find that the third party policy basically tells you to go screw yourself.
yeah,
It basically says, here's our third party section. We share it to X, Y, and Z, and that's whatever they do with it is their own thing.
yeah.
Um, but you wouldn't know because you never bothered to check, because none of us bothered to check.
Yeah, because you think,
It's
well,
reached
I'm
a
just
point where they can
Spotify is
be,
nice because it gives me the music that I want. Whereas, in fact, your choice of music is a massive psychological profile of you that is then sold on the open market. So all of these treats, which are the cheese on the mousetrap for us now, this seems to be what this digital world is about. It's about the treats that are data traps that will allow enhanced manipulation of you as they observe you being happy about them or being angry about them or whatever.
yeah, and it shows the impact of the kind of teams of psychologists and cognitive scientists and behavioral scientists that they had working not only for these social networks, but working within these public relations firms and these electioneering firms. And quite specifically, they talk about cognitive psychology, they talk about heuristics, they talk about studying biases, and how the algorithms can leverage those psychological dynamics against the user. From the affect heuristic, where your emotions are engaging you and hooking you, to the availability heuristic, where, the more instances of a particular thing you see, the more you start to believe it as being representative of the world out there. Um, and, there's also, this talk of dopamine cycles and dopamine hits and things like that. Um, you experience the reward mechanisms of your brain light up when you experience confirming information, when your biases are confirmed.
Yeah,
That triggers it's kind of pleasant. Um,
yeah,
but it's so dangerous. It
yeah.
is so dangerous.
But it's
But
literally a
because your algorithm is
physiological
going to
reward
now,
mechanism that is being manipulated, but manipulated with very, very great personally targeted specificity that was not historically possible before these
mm,
technologies suddenly came into being. So let's kind of wrap up a bit, and I think a note to end up on. I am, I, I am at risk of pessimism at this point. That the machine has become so powerful. I'm seeing like Palantir, Peter Thiel, a crossover from being social control to massive investment in kind of military technologies, literally proposing new forms of state military fascism and explicitly saying, no, democracy was a bad idea. We're having, the Alex Karps and the Peter Thiels of the world, this new surveillance billionaire class, explicitly saying, no, the last 200 years
the
of Western
Curtis Yarvins,
democracy, that was a mistake. Yeah, the Curtis Yarvins. Um, what strategies or indicators of hope or optimism can you leave us with?
Phew. Yeah, that's the real hard question. Um, Look, I think that there's kind of growing awareness that we are being manipulated, and I think that is really important. And we've been seeing kind of people starting to learn how to take control of their algorithms. But I think that that's also something that, a lot of people just don't realize is there. That these social networks do give you the tools to say, hey, I don't want to see this in my feed anymore.
Yeah.
Or report something that, hey, this is inflammatory, or this is misinformation, or this is we need to start taking control of these tools because, look, otherwise we are just being this free source of data for these things, for these empires, and you know um, we don't get anything from it in return otherwise. All that we get these days is you're probably left feeling a bit worse after you used it, but you got stuck on there for a bit, and you scrolled and you binged and you um, but yeah, we need to reclaim these spaces back for ourselves. And the platforms do give us some of these tools.
Mm.
Aside from reporting, but just to be like, look, I don't want to see this in my feed. I
Mm.
don't want to see from anything from this page.
Yeah.
I don't want to see anything from this creator. Or I don't want to see any of
Or you can
this
even
type of
lie back to
material.
the algorithm. You can fake responses to
Yeah.
to to do a judo flip on the algorithm. It's like, oh, I'm gonna jinx my algorithm by doing these things which are not really me, but are meant to fuck with the surveillance. So people. I mean, the initial problem, the Cambridge Analytica moment, people didn't even know that this was happening. Now we've kind of been through a stage of shock. People are realizing and that realization, that consciousness is the beginning of resistance. And so perhaps we're going into the phase of like, okay, what are the new modes of resistance? And I think we leave that for people to think about. And just to note, this paper we've deliberately made it open access. You can download it. We'll add the link, and also the link for Ahmed's Democracy, Disinformation, Disaster blog, which is just this fantastic other tunnel you can choose to go down or not. Okay, great. So thanks, and we'll have another of these chats really soon.
Absolutely.